Michael has, when I came into this club, Michael, at that time, Jeffrey is probably the most important person as a videographer, but Michael, when I would hear him talk, a very incredible speaker who has a lot of, I guess he didn't have a lot of speaking expertise. He's gained a lot of it through here from what he's been telling me, but he's a natural at speaking, in my opinion. He has a very, very good way with a crowd, and he has won a couple of contests, and won contests through here, and so it's really a pleasure to be able to listen to Michael. Today, Michael's speech is Rio da Dúvida, and we'd like to welcome him up to the podium, Michael Somps.
Rio da Dúvida, the river of doubt. An ominous name, isn't it? And an appropriate name for this river 100 years ago. A river that winds its way like a snake through the Amazon for 400 miles. A river that was unknown to the civilized world, was as unexplored as the surface of the moon. Yet its secrets would soon be revealed. But not by some famous explorer from the early 1900s. No, by a United States president. The year was 1912, and Theodore Roosevelt had just lost his attempt for a third term as president, and he was despondent. Yet he responded, as he had to so many events in his life, by seeking out a challenge, a great adventure. And that adventure would be a trip to South America. Now that trip originated with the idea of giving some guest lectures in Brazil, but it evolved into something else. Roosevelt wasn't going to go all the way to South America just to give some lectures. He was going to indulge his interests for natural history. And the plan evolved into including in the trip sailing up the coast of Brazil to the Amazon River, up that river to some of its tributaries. A relatively safe trip, even for that time, for Roosevelt to go on. And it would give him an opportunity to experience the wildlife in the Amazon. But that plan evolved even more, exponentially. When Roosevelt arrived in Brazil, there was a casual suggestion by a friend of his that drastically changed the course of this adventure. It would end up leaving a mark on history. The friend's suggestion was to go down an unknown river, a river in the middle of the Amazon. Roosevelt seized on this idea. He dreamed of being a great explorer, and this fit in perfectly with that dream. And the decision was made to go down the river, down. Well, this was a serious change in plans that effectively put Roosevelt, a former president of the United States, put his life in jeopardy. But he was committed. And he probably understood the perils that he placed himself in when he said, if it is necessary for me to leave my bones in South America, I am quite ready to do so. And in December of 1913, Theodore Roosevelt, at the age of 55, set off on this grand adventure. With him was his youngest son, Kermit, who was living and working in Brazil. And he had a co-commander, a Colonel Bandido Rondon, who was a Brazilian and knew the Amazon because he helped construct the telegraph line across Brazil. And you might think that this adventure began at the headwaters of the River of Doubt, but it didn't. It began far from the River of Doubt. It required travel over water and over land, over a vast expanse of space, twice the size of Texas. And it was immensely hard for them to get there. Men, in fact, abandoned the expedition. It was so hard. Oxen and mule perished. Supplies and provisions were lost. The environment was so hard for these men that many suffered malaria. In fact, Kermit came down with malaria, and he, from that point forward, had a fever for the rest of the expedition, above 100 degrees. But eventually, after 2 months, they did reach the headwaters of the River of Doubt. Amazingly, they arrived there without any means of floating down the river. The 800-pound motorboats that they had originally arrived in Brazil with, well, those were impractical to transport over that vast distance. The canoes that they had opted for had to be left behind when the mules could no longer carry them. So the only option they had when they arrived was to purchase 7 dilapidated, hollowed-out trees from the local Indian tribe. Some that weighed as much as 2,500 pounds apiece, and when loaded with provisions and men, were just inches above the water. But that's what they had to go down this river. And so they set off in February of 1914 down the River of Doubt. But at this point, it was a race against time. They were already running out of food. And imagine that their survival depended on navigating this river that nobody knew anything about. They didn't know how long they were going to be on the river. But off they went. Now they had countless dangers amassed against them, from vicious wildlife to the unknown dangers of the river, to the Amazonian Indians that lived along the river that had never encountered the outside world and were known to be vicious. On that first day when they set off down the river that was their lifeline to the civilized world, they needed for their survival, also became one of the greatest dangers. The river that started out so calmly and tranquilly turned into surging rapids. Rapids that they weren't capable of navigating with these tree trunks, and to pull off the river, and they had to machete their way through the rainforest and portage all their supplies and these heavy dugouts for days to get around a single set of rapids. And they found themselves doing this over and over and over again for each set of rapids and waterfall. It tremendously slowed down this expedition and put all their lives in jeopardy. The wildlife was also a constant threat. Roosevelt himself almost lost his life to a coral snake. A snake that, if it bites you, you're dead in 30 minutes. It's guaranteed death in the middle of the Amazon. One day when in camp they came across a coral snake, and amongst the chaotic response, it was Roosevelt who went to stomp on that snake and kill it, only to have that snake turn around and strike him. Fortunately, the fangs of the snake didn't penetrate his boot. Roosevelt survived that encounter. Disease was another hardship. Almost all the men ended up suffering malaria, including Kermit and Roosevelt. But Roosevelt's malaria was compounded when he got a gash on his leg hitting a rock in the river. He got a horrendous infection that brought him to the brink of death. At one point, he insisted on being left behind. He knew that trying to save him put everyone's lives in danger. Even Colonel Rondon insisted that Roosevelt had to be left behind. But it was his son, Kermit, who was a very determined individual and decided there was no way he was going to leave his father to die in the Amazon. And he found a way to get his father out of there. Despite all these challenges, the expedition eventually, in April of 1914, reached the mouth of the River of Doubt in some semblance of civilization. 4 months after beginning the expedition, 2 months after getting on the river. And at this point, they were almost completely out of provisions. They were in rags. They only had 4 of the original 7 dugouts. Of the 22 men they started with, they had lost 3. 1 had drowned, 1 was murdered, and 1 was abandoned for his treachery. And Roosevelt was still on his deathbed. But Roosevelt survived, and he accomplished his goal. He became an explorer in his own right. It was an amazing feat to go down this river in the middle of the Amazon. And the river, and the world, would soon know about it. In fact, Rio da Dúvida would no longer be be known by that name. Brazil officially named the river. Rio Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, left his mark in South America.